In 1357, a royal armada left the kingdom of Sunda, located on the western half of the island of Java, in what is today Indonesia. A grand fleet of 200 large warships and 2,000 smaller vessels, consisting of junks, barges, and nimble skiffs that cut through the shimmering blue Java Sea. Atop the ninth deck of the largest and most decorated of the junks was Maharaja Lingua Buana, the ruler of the kingdom of Sunda, along with his royal court. An elaborate gathering of finely dressed nobles, guardsmen, retainers, and family members who would be needed for this important expedition. An army in their thousands that had rallied to their king's side. Their destination was the capital of the Majapahit Empire, a hated rival that had attempted to subjugate the smaller kingdom for decades. Though Buana was a fearsome warrior and renowned statesman, he was not coming as a conqueror, but at the invitation of the young emperor, Hayam Wuruk, who made the Sundanese an appealing offer. That offer was a marriage proposal to the Maharaja's daughter and a promise of peace, a holy wedding to unify the two feuding kingdoms and create a prosperous future for both. The wealth of the Spice Islands would wash over both peoples and birth a new empire the likes of which the archipelago had never seen. A glorious future that would never come to be. What should have been a joyous occasion for King Buana and his daughter would dissolve into betrayal and bloodshed and end in tragedy at a market square in the heart of the Majapahit capital. A shameful deed orchestrated by a cunning and ruthless man whose actions would stain the empire for the rest of history and leave a permanent mark of distrust on the island of Java. In the 14th century, the kingdom of Sunda had been experiencing a glorious age, thanks largely to the steadfast rule of King Buana himself. The Sunda were an old kingdom that could trace its birth back to the 7th century, and Buana's family could boast of sharing the blood of both the old kings of Taruma, as well as the divine rulers of the late Srivijayan Empire that had once dominated the islands. It was a lineage that commanded respect from his peers, and Buana had built an image of a strong and honorable king who was known for his wisdom, piety, and generous wealth. Using the vast rice fields that thrive in the rich volcanic soil of Java, he was able to trade with the other islands and establish a network of vassal kingdoms. The large trading fleets from China, carrying porcelain and silks, would arrive, trading for the rice reserves, before continuing up the narrow Malacca Strait and onto the rich markets in India. All of it made Sunda a very prosperous and wealthy kingdom, with a renowned and strong ruler. Unfortunately, this prosperity came in the shadow of a greater power. The neighboring Majapahit Empire, once a fledgling city-state, had rapidly expanded into a leviathan of the seas, spreading its influence across the archipelago. It owed its rapid expansion to its own steady-handed rulers, namely the saintly god emperor Hayam Wuruk and his Machiavelli prime minister, Gajah Mada. Wuruk was seen as a divine ruler, being born in the shadow of an erupting volcano, as though the gods themselves had heralded his birth. He was supposed to have had mystical powers that allowed him to perform miracles, such as calming storms, commanding crops to grow, and even taming wild beasts with a whisper. All these stemmed from his pious religious devotions to the many Hindu gods and the preservation of their shrines. His virtuous life and just rulership saw a flourishing of culture in his court, where he displayed his vast wealth and power. Golden statues, birds of paradise that could sing on command, a golden chariot pulled by wild exotic beasts, markets filled with spices and silks. Scholars, poets, and artists from across the islands came to be mystified by the capital and would leave with tales of its many splendors. Wuruk brought his people prosperity and lavished wealth upon his loyal vassals, who jostled to be in the presence of a living god and the air of respect that it gave them. Yet the real task of empire building had been in the hands of a man named Gajah Mada, also known as the Elephant General. The wily prime minister was a crafty and shrewd man, known for his Machiavelli genius and political ruthlessness. Even today, modern Indonesian politicians try to emulate his formula for success, with even former presidents modeling themselves after him. Indonesian nationalists consider him to be an early hero and visionary for attempting to unify the islands. He was the power behind the throne, pulling the strings like an expert puppet master, and keeping the royal court and island vassals loyal through his many intrigues. A noble or official who he found to be displeasing could easily be replaced by a more trustworthy rival. Even members of the royal family could be sent to govern one of the Empire's many new far-flung vassals, away from the capital and unable to cause trouble. Beginning his career as a captain of the palace guard, Mada uncovered a plot to slay Wuruk's predecessor. Seeing an opportunity, he spirited the emperor and his family away from the capital and its many dangers. Once safe, he returned to the royal court to discover who was involved in the plot. Once he had the names of the conspirators, Mada and his elite guard retook the palace and restored the imperial family. For this act, he was quickly promoted until he reached the position of prime minister, being prized for his loyalty and quick thinking. For 30 years, he held his post as prime minister and worked tirelessly to further the empire's reach. Leveraging the large rice fields, he was able to establish his own trading networks. Relying on the old tribute system unique to the islands, Mada could draw upon a network of loyal vassals who pledged their allegiance to the empire for protection and economic aid. This meant that Majapahit didn't need to maintain direct control from its capital, but instead could rely on its possessions to govern themselves. When this system failed, Majapahit's powerful navy was called in. Mada personally led his armies across the islands, subjugating Bali, Madura, and Sumatra in a series of bloody campaigns. He showed his martial prowess by defeating the remaining Srivijayan lords, bringing them to heel and dispelling their influence in the region. From here he used the navy to secure the narrow Malacca Strait that was the major vital trading lane from which all spice trade flowed through. With the trading network under lock and key, the empire took possession of the vital spice islands, securing the supply of nutmeg, cloves, and mace. Spices that were greatly sought after by the rich markets in Asia, India, the Middle East, and even Europe. Though common now, these items were so rare that a handful of nutmeg or pepper could make a man as wealthy as a king. With its navy prowling the seas and its army controlling the islands, Majapahit had a near monopoly on the spice trade, making it one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires of the medieval world. This allowed Mada to quickly sew up the archipelago, from the tip of Sumatra to the coast of Borneo, and across the Java Seas to the island of Papua. It had taken Sunda centuries to reach its golden age, but Majapahit had eclipsed all other rivals in just under 50 years. Yet the one kingdom that defied him was the Sunda and King Bwana. No offer of spices or riches could entice the old king to submit, and the Majapahit army made poor gains into Sunda territory, with the navy also failing to break Bwana's pride. Mada's plans for continued expansion were thrown into jeopardy, but the Elephant General always knew how to find an opportunity. So he went to the emperor with an idea. If Sunda would not submit to offers of wealth or could not be subdued by invasion, then why not an offer of marriage instead? Everything would fall into place. A marriage between the emperor and Bwana's daughter, the Princess Pitaloka, would bring Sunda into the imperial fold, while allowing the old king to retain his crown, as well as his kingdom's independence. One lavish marriage ceremony to end all wars and build a lasting peace that would secure the empire. The emperor, overjoyed, agreed to the proposal and dispatched messengers to the Sunda court. Bwana was pleased by the offer and all the wealth and prestige that it would bring. There was also the prospect that his grandchildren could be the future rulers of Majapahit. So the king, the princess, and the royal court ordered their grand fleet and arrived at the bay of the Brantus River before disembarking with 200 retainers and proceeding on foot. Arriving at the capital in a swirl of music and courtly finery, with colourful banners fluttering in the hot breeze, and golden holy daggers, known as kriss blades, shimmering on their pearl-studded belts, they made an impression to rival their host's own splendour. Making camp at Bubat Square, just north of the royal palace, they waited to be met by the emperor and to begin the wedding ceremony and the joyful bombastic celebrations that would follow. But it wasn't the emperor who came to greet his new family. As one of the red-bricked palace gates opened, out walked Gajah, dressed in plate armor, flanked by his best soldiers. Naturally, the king asked where the emperor was, and Mada decided to stress some details that he had conveniently withheld. There would be a wedding, but Pitaloka would not be a queen, but a royal concubine. Any children she would have would not be in the line of succession, and of course Sunda would still have to submit to vassaldom. Maharaja Bwana was outraged and refused to degrade himself or his daughter with such an offer. After dressing down the smirking prime minister, he informed his nobles of the deception and readied them to leave. But now the trap that had been carefully laid snapped shut. The Sundanese had been lured in by Mada's design with the offer of a royal marriage. Troops poured in from the gates and surrounded the bridal party. They were to be prisoners, not guests. But the Sunda kingdom had resisted Majapahit for generations, stubbornly refusing to submit, and on that hot day in Bubat Square would be no different. With a great cry, the king and his nobles drew their blades and fell like a typhoon upon their betrayers, slashing and stabbing with murderous fury. Hot blood spilled across the square. Twice the soldiers struggled to throw them back, and twice more the Sundanese regrouped and charged again. When a Sunda guard fell, another picked up his weapon. Slaves protected their masters with their lives, and nobles fought in blood-stained finery, throwing themselves against their foes. Their gilded crisp blades not just for ceremony, but deadly razor-sharp weapons in their expert hands. But they stood no chance against the well-trained Majapahit infantry, who marched over the bodies of the fallen and forced the Sundanese back, their military discipline overcoming Sunda's rage. As King Bwana made one last attempt to rally the remains of his court, Mada ordered his guards to advance and finish the slaughter. The old king charged once more, blade in hand, determined to slay the betrayer, but was cut to pieces by a sea of swords. From the center of it all sat Pitaloka, watching what should have been the happiest day of her life turn into a bloody nightmare. Her family and friends massacred in front of her, their bodies piling all around. It must have been a despairing sight. Yet she was a princess of Sunda, and like her father, she would not submit. So with great courage, she drew her holy kris, a sacred dagger, and raised it so the gods could witness, and ran the blade through her heart. She fell amongst the bodies of her family, her blood pooling on the square as her father's crown was crushed under a Majapahit boot. The elephant general showed no mercy. He had his men finish off any survivors and left Bubat Square a stinking crimson ruin. The scribes of the Pararaton, a historic text, describe it as such. Like a sea of blood and a mountain of carcasses, there are no Sundanese left. Once news of the massacre reached the remains of the Sunda fleet, they fled back to the kingdom. The members of the royal family that had remained behind were struck by a deep sorrow, with the people collectively mourning the great loss that they had suffered. But quickly that sorrow turned to hate, with the Sunda vowing to never bend to their hated rival. Even today, Majapahit is a vile slur, used as an insult in West Sunda, and the empire is not remembered fondly. If Gajah Mada was proud of his accomplishment, then it would be a short-lived success. His actions, though brutal, shocked the royal court and disgusted the nobles, none so more than the emperor himself. Hayam Wuruk was deeply disturbed by the nature of the plot, luring the Sunda royals with the false offer of a marriage, only to slaughter them on the doorstep of the palace. The god king viewed his prime minister's actions as the lowest a man could achieve. Wuruk had been warm to the idea of a marriage. It was a very simple and effective way of welcoming new allies into the imperial fold. One more wife simply meant one more vassal that could uphold his own rule, and children to expand the imperial family. Quickly Mada found himself shut out of the corridors of power. His allies turned on him, and he was stripped of his position and banished from the capital. The man called the Elephant General, who had pledged to conquer all the archipelago, would die 7 years later in obscurity, a victim of his own schemes. The royal court would bear the stain of its prime minister's deception throughout its reign, the massacre being seen as a black spot on its gilded reputation. For the Sundanese, their defiant last stand would make them the stuff of legend, choosing to die honorably instead of being defeated and captured by their hated enemy. Many nobles regarded them as an example to live by, with even the Balinese royal court, the spiritual successors to the Majapahit name, considering Pitaloka as the ideal noble woman, valiantly sacrificing herself to protect her name and honor, rather than be captured. It was an act that would be immortalized in the works of the Kidung Sunda, an epic poem that retells the tragic events. Though its reputation had been tarnished, the empire would continue to expand and conquer new territories until Wuruk's death in 1389. A rebellion amongst his sons, known as the Regret War, would rock the empire and see it begin a sharp decline. In 1527, the last imperial holdouts would be conquered by the young and energetic Sultan of Demak, one of the many new Islamic kingdoms that had taken roots across the islands. Though Sunda too would also fall to the new faith, it would live just long enough to gleefully watch its hated rival be swallowed up by the new kingdoms, and would have the last laugh by outliving the empire by just over 50 years, the same amount of time it took for Majapahit to reach its epoch.